Thank you for having me, and I'm glad to be here. And I've been here for 3 years already, and I hesitated to give a talk at OPR mostly because this project was in preparation. I mean, so I'll talk a little bit about the preparation. So I'm finally, I have some results, and this is work in progress that I'll talk about today. Basically this is part of a several multinational survey, several country survey in Latin America that I began about the time that I got here, or a little after I got here, and it's got 2 stages which I'll talk about. But I have collaborators in Colombia, Peru, Mexico, and Brazil. So the work has involved them, along with some students here that have begun working with me on some projects, and particularly Renee Flores, who's been participated this since the inception. So the idea of pigmentocracy, I mean, Magali said this, I never heard that word. Well, this was coined in 1942 actually by a Chilean anthropologist named Alejandro Lipschutz, and it hasn't been paid attention to. I mean, people use it occasionally, but they don't pay attention to it very often. But anyways, the importance of this is that, it was an idea that's kind of been, it was an idea that came up, and it seemed to some people obvious that, that Latin America is stratified by race and ethnicity and by skin color. So if you read Lipschutz's original work, he talks about indigenous people and the black and mulatto people, and then sometimes he'll say skin color. So he uses these things. He goes back and forth in his use of these things and never really distinguish why one's important or the other. So that's, nobody's really done this yet, and so that's one of the things I want to focus on. But the other important point about this is this was 1942. That's 70 years ago. That's a long time. And it's surprising the little work that's been done in this area in Latin America, with the exception of Brazil. Brazil has actually had a lot more work. Much of my work, or most of my work on Latin America is on Brazil. And in Brazil, they've had this history of research on race, racism, racial discrimination, et cetera, for the last 30 years or more. And but it seems like it's always seen as an exception. But even in Brazil, up until about 10 or 15 years ago, they had this idea of the country as a racial democracy where race didn't make a difference. But the rest of Latin America, there's not much research at all, and often they still have this idea of racial democracy and it ignores issues of race. So this idea of pigmentocracy kind of flies in the face of it. Okay, so I talk about race and ethnicity. I don't want to get bogged down in what's the difference between race and ethnicity. I mean, it's a long discussion, and people have different views of this. But that's why I use Enthnoracial. And actually, I didn't know it had a dash in it. It's not in the dictionary. I got a dash in it because of the spell check. So sometimes it uses it, sometimes it doesn't. But anyway, so this is to combine the idea of ethnicity and race that greatly overlap, of course. But in Latin America, blacks and mulattoes are often seen as race, and indigenous people are seen as ethnicity. But anyway, for now, let's think of these are similar kinds of things. Now, just a little background on Latin America. The demographic importance of this, the size of the African origin and the indigenous population is much greater than the U.S. So I think it's important to give you a little bit of background so you can get an appreciation for the differences with the United States, because ethnicity and race has played out very differently. They have histories of slavery, and then they had large indigenous groups that were eventually marginalized. That's similar to the United States. But the way, and you have, of course, the pigmentocracy and the inequality being created, in fact, but the way people have thought about these things has been very different. Okay. Now, oh, Renee, we missed the slide. Anyways, I had another slide I was going to put in there, but anyways, I got lost when my computer broke down just before this. But just to give you an idea, basically, is background. Latin America has this idea of mixture. I mean, if you can think of a real simple way to understand it, it's oversimplified, of course, is the idea of mixture in Latin America and segregation in the United States, okay? Now, obviously, that's too simple for either of them. But the whole idea of mixture comes, first of all, from the idea that, I mean, there's actually, during colonization, the Spanish and the Portuguese came to Latin America, and they were often single men that came to Latin America rather than families like the British colonists. I mean, so if you look at the sex ratio for the Portuguese and Spanish colonizers, of course, it's high, and it's more balanced in the U.S. case. So what they did, and of course there's these power relationships with indigenous and black and mulatto women, that they often, you know, cohabited with these women, you know, and then often, and then they had children that were often, of course, mixed race. So the Portuguese men, especially those of low status, didn't get together with Portuguese women. I mean, the Portuguese women were for the more higher status. I guess that's the way the marriage market works, right? So they often created progeny from their relations with these women. Often these were forcible, you know, rape kinds of situation. But anyways, a large mixed race population was created. The other issue that was, as a result of that, I mean, the other thing that happened of that, of course, mixed race categories, racial categories are widely recognized throughout Latin America, some countries more than others. Unlike the U.S. The U.S. had a mulatto category up until 1910, but there were relatively few people in those categories. And increasingly, you know, this issue of multiracialism is becoming increasingly important. So this idea, you know, of mixture is becoming increasingly important in the U.S. Not that it's not important at all. But the other thing about mixture is that national elites, during the period of nationalizing and creating nations, particularly in the 19th century up until the early 20th century, national elites created this idea of mixture, and that this was, you know, we were morally superior, particularly by the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. We were superior, Latin American nations were superior in one thing. I mean, clearly we didn't have segregation like the U.S. had. So there was this kind of idea of moral superiority. So they really played up this idea of mixture and the use of mixed race categories. And eventually created this, of course, this idea that because we have so much mixture, we don't have discrimination. Okay, so discrimination is not our problem like it is in the U.S. In the U.S., it was obvious. There was racial segregation. In Latin America, no, we don't have that. And this has actually affected the research that's been done on this. So I think, you know, we're not independent of national ideologies and the way common people think. Often the reasons we get into the subjects we get into has to do, of course, with you know, our interests and what we think are important. And in Latin America, of course, a lot of the researchers thought, you know, this is not an important issue, especially because of these strong national ideologies. So they didn't do much research on this until very recently. Okay. So anyway, so getting into the project then, that's a little bit of background. So the other thing about mixture is there's a lot of ambiguity in the categories, and I'll show you that later on. So the idea of race and ethnicity, I mean, you're increasingly collecting this data on the censuses, and this is one of the things that I'm interested in, is that what good are these data going to do? And I see these data as problematic, and they may not solve all the issues that people are concerned. I mean, the analysts think, oh, this is a kind of a panacea. We'll really be able to show racial inequality. And I don't think that's so clear, because these categories are really ambiguous, and they often don't overlap. So in Mexico, if you ask people, you know, I'll show you the question later on. I mean, you ask people if they're white, mestizo, indigenous, mulatto, or black, and most of them will say they're mestizo. But there's huge skin color variations among the mestizo category. And there's people that call themselves white that are darker than some of the people that are calling themselves mestizos. So these, you know, the way people are perceived is often different from the way people are self-identifying. So so far I've been doing a lot of research on, now we have these data, I've been doing a lot of research on how people self-identify, especially in relation to their skin color. And I've looked at public opinion, and now I'm starting to look at the stratification issues. And this, of course, is the beginning of this research. But anyways, so the project on ethnicity and race in Latin America is the name. Perla is the name of the project that I've been working on, and we have a web page. I won't show you the web page because I've got a lot of slides to show you. But Mariana Campos, I don't know if she's here, but yeah, Mariana has been working on the website, and so we have a website. If you want to go to it, it's right there, and we're translating into Portuguese and Spanish, and I think we've already gotten a lot of hits on it. So some of this research and some of the ideas for it are on that website. The project on ethnicity and race in Latin America is like I said, a multinational collaborative project. But the important thing is based on national random surveys, national random sample surveys, and it's based on 2 stages. And this is what I've been doing. Basically, the first 2 years since I've been here is developing these surveys, and often with the we've had 3 meetings here at Princeton University. One to plan the survey, another one to talk about initial results, and a third one we talked about we created these rough drafts of chapters for a book that we're putting together, and some Princeton professors here commented on those chapters. The first chapter is the first stage of this project, and so what I'm using here is drawing from both stages. But the first stage is an ethnicity module in the Americas barometer. And let's see if so these are, for short for that, these are LAPOP surveys. Americas barometer is the same thing as the Latin American Public Opinion Project. And the LAPOP surveys are face-to-face surveys in 24 countries in the America based at Vanderbilt University. These are surveys, they're available in Princeton Data Services. You can use these. They're mostly political science based. They're concerned about political culture generally. And that's, it's funded mostly by the U.S. State Department. So the U.S. State Department wants to know, for example, the reason they fund these is that they have this idea, Latin America in the last 20 years, it changed from majority dictatorships to where there's only one country, and maybe increasingly close to 2 that don't have democratically elected governments. And so it had this big switch, but there's always a threat, of course, that these things could turn around again. But the idea of the Latin American Public Opinion Project is that you can understand democracy and the way people think. Understanding public opinion is an important part to democracy. So it's not just people voting for representatives, and we know all the problems that has, but you can actually go draw from a random sample and ask people public opinion about, whether you trust your representatives, whether you believe in the Supreme Court, what do you think about the police, all these different things. But what Perla has done is added an ethnicity module that they never had. And in that ethnicity module, in 23 countries, we were able to add ethnoracial identification and skin color measures, which I'll talk about later. And 23, and Haiti is the only country that doesn't have it, and that's because when they went out and did the survey in 2010, they had the Haiti earthquake, so they really had to reduce the survey. And then we focused on 8 countries, the 4 countries that I mentioned, plus Bolivia, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, and Ecuador, and where we have a little more than 10 ethnicity, race, and class origin items, and these include questions about public opinion. About half of them are about public opinion, and the other half are largely about reported discrimination, either themselves or having seen discrimination against other people. Okay, and then the Perla surveys are the second stage, and that's in 4 Latin American countries. And in those cases, we did, these are about 100 survey items. This is an in-depth survey that lasted anywhere from a half an hour for the most educated people to, some cases it lasted more than 2 hours. And these are of 4 countries. In 4 countries, we did anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 surveys, and we did oversamples of Afro-Colombians, Mexican indigenous people, and Afro-Mexicans. So we have the oversample. These are small. We don't have census data. That's the reason, and we're starting to have census data on ethnicity and race. We don't have census data on skin color, for example. We're probably never going to, you know, it wouldn't be wise to have a census where you ask people about skin color, of course. So you're able to do things, of course, with these small surveys. Okay. Okay, so research question number 1. Is how is it socioeconomic status related to ethno-racial identification? So this is plugging in the dummy variable, you know, that we, you know, some people do, as Betsy suggested. So how does that affect, you know, and of course it's very complicated. So before I get to that, I'll talk about the new census questions in Latin America. So Latin America, as of 2000, about 2000, all of a sudden they're concerned about, the governments are concerned about race and ethnicity. And part of this is through pressure from the United Nations, in particular the Committee Against the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and an international community that's worried about these things. And black movements that are increasingly brought into, black and indigenous movements that are increasingly brought into these UN civil society forums that can pressure governments, and often it's through shame of some governments against other governments. So Latin American countries, and almost all of them have a question on indigenous, about identifying indigenous people. Some questions are better than others, of course. All of them except for the, you know, probably you can make, Dominican Republic and Cuba make arguments that indigenous people were wiped out 200 years ago and there's none left. And that may be true, but all the other countries have indigenous questions. Now most countries have questions on Afro-descendants, which are, you know, usually use the category black and mulatto, and sometimes they use other categories. And that's mostly been, except for Brazil, who's had this question since 1872, since their first census. All the other countries is pretty new. There were occasions in which the countries used the census before, but then they'd have it, you know, it would be very sporadic. But since about 2000, most of the countries now have a question about that. But they're really slow at releasing the data, and I'm developing a project with a Brazilian and a Spanish colleague that are coming up next year on using the IPUMs and trying to, and other sources, trying to get some of that census data and look at these issues of stratification. Okay, so the questions, you can see that the questions vary a lot among the countries about how you ask about race or ethnicity. Now, the way you ask affects the answers you get, okay, and the categories that you use, okay. So like the categories, so most of the countries have one question for blacks and indigenous, but countries like Venezuela and Paraguay have separate questions for identifying Afro-descendants and indigenous people. And the way they ask about indigenous people, you know, is sometimes they ask about language, sometimes they ask about, you know, are you indigenous? Sometimes they ask you, like in Peru, are you Quechua or Aymara or one of these other groups? And previously, in previous census, they actually identified indigenous people based on the interviewer rating on the community he lived in, or whether he was dressed, or whether he wore sandals, or what food he ate. So, you know, but these, of course, are historical remnants, I hope. So the getting back to the issue of the categories. So like Brazil says your color or race is, and then this is basic. Since 1872, it hasn't changed much, except the word race was added in 1990. But it just asks what is your color, and the response categories were basically white, black, pardo, which is kind of this brown kind of collective category, indigenous or Asian. Okay. So there's a question, you know, what is your color, indigenous or Asian? That's, you know, that's the way it was. It's, you know, that's they added race, and you know, so there's all these issues, and so if you ask in Peru, for example, you ask and you do a question like that, and then you ask people, are you Quechua or Aymara? You'll find that the people that are Quechua, only 15% said they're indigenous. Okay, so indigenous has this very derogatory connotation, and Aymaras, maybe just over half of them will say they're indigenous. So you know, that's a problem of asking indigenous. Of course, these things, vary from country to country. I mean, the term might not be so stigmatized in Brazil as it is in Peru, for example. But anyway, so that's how you're asking. So that's part of what we're doing with these in-depth surveys, where we have 100 items, is where we can cross-tabulate these different ways of asking the question and seeing, trying to get some kind of, not saying one's right or wrong, but basically saying, these are the kinds of estimates you'll get. You'll get larger numbers with this way or smaller numbers this other way. Okay, so basically there's a single question in the America's barometer, and we also use this question I should say LabPop or America's barometer. And there's a similar question in the 4 peerless surveys. Do you consider yourself white, mestizo, indigenous, black, mulatto, or other? And that's the question in Spanish. Now in Portuguese, of course, it's only for Brazil. They use the Brazilian census categories. But most Spanish-speaking countries use that question that's in Spanish and translated into English, except a few exceptions. I mean, Venezuela uses another category called moreno. Guatemala doesn't use white, but it uses Ladino. Basically, is mestizo and white. So there's a few little differences. There's 3 or 4 distinctions. I mean, differences from the general pattern. So basically, getting to the issue of stratification. Now I can get to a little bit of the analysis. Actually, I didn't think I'd get there this fast. Okay. So basically, what we've done here is we've combined LAPOP and the peerless samples, and we've got about 2,500 or 3,000 cases. So in the case of 4 of those countries, except for Ecuador, participated in the peerless study. But the reason we're including Ecuador in there is that they did a large sample in the case of Ecuador with the LAPOP data. So we have 25 to 3,000 people in each of these countries. So you'll see, I probably should have, it would have been clearer if I had cut the graph off right here, and I thought about that. But anyways, this shows the differences in education. And you can see that indigenous people clearly have the lowest levels of education in Latin America. Oh, I know what I forgot to mention. I think this is striking. Before we get to this, there's 40 million indigenous people in Latin America. And you know what the number of indigenous people who self-identify as indigenous in the U.S. is?
It's less than 2 million.
Yeah, it's less than 2 million. Exactly. There's 40 million in Latin America, and they're mostly in 4 or 5 countries. But the African descended population is really, so the U.S. has this paradigm. I mean, we think of race and ethnicity, and we think of the U.S. as the paradigmatic case. And it's the U.S. I mean, if you look at the African descended population, you know how many slaves the U.S. brought from Africa, or how many Africans they brought for slavery? It's about 400,000. Brazil had almost 5 million, and the rest of Latin America had about 2 million. This is the Spanish-speaking part, and then you look at the British and the Dutch and everything. So all of the countries south of the U.S. border had 25 times as many Africans were brought as the U.S. brought. So the U.S. is relatively small. So we do a lot of research, of course, because a lot of the people that do the research are Americans. We have data that's more available. You can go through all the reasons. Generally. So I think the purpose of this, think about race and ethnicity in a wider sense instead of the kind of in the parochial sense that we often think about in the social sciences. Okay, so getting back to this figure, so you see, so this is ethno-racial identification based on self-identification, and self-identification, you can see that in the Brazilian case, clearly whites are more educated. Although if you use the census data, for some reason, if you use the census data, the gap is even bigger. So it's 8.5 years versus just over 7 years for pardos and blacks. and it's now a little bigger. It's actually the gap is decreasing a little bit with younger generations. It's been decreasing the last 20 years, and that's with improvements in education overall. But in Mexico, the indigenous are clearly have lower levels of education, and of course, that's not to mention the quality, there's not enough people that identify as mulatto or as black in that country. In Colombia, you see mulattoes actually have as high a level of education as whites and mestizos, and et cetera. So you can see, so the mulatto thing in Colombia is particularly striking. We've been thinking about that. What? Yeah, a lot of people expect a gradient. So they expect the white mestizo to be high and the other categories to be low. That's basically what people expect. How? 2010. So that's when we did the survey. Oh, these are everybody. I think what do we use? Above 25. Yeah. Right, exactly. If we looked at younger cohorts, we don't have the sample size really to look at younger cohorts. That's exactly right. So we didn't do that. We can't do that fine-grained analysis, which we're hoping to do when we have the census. But anyways, the point of this is to show that the differences aren't that large, and when we look at skin color, the differences might be different. But the other interesting thing is look at the difference between whites and mestizos. And these are not in Peru, but in Colombia and Mexico, there are significant differences in education and other socioeconomic status variables between whites and mestizos. And a lot of people would expect whites to be better off, but they're not. In the census data, you rarely have this white mestizo breakdown. You're not even in the ones that are being planned. But people that self-identify as white, we found, are people that tend to be lower educated. These are people the same skin color, okay? And probably, I suppose, nobody's really looked at this in the field, but these are people that have low levels of social capital in many different ways, and maybe this is the only capital they have, and they're comparing themselves next to their peers that are probably darker, so that they want to emphasize the whiteness. But in a country like Mexico, of course, you emphasize this issue of mestizaje, and of course middle-class people generally are proud, with some regional differences, are proud of the fact that they're mestizos, even if they're not biologically mixed. We don't know that. Okay, and going the wrong direction. Well, I can do it with this little baby. Okay, so the household income, you see similar kinds of things going on. Okay, let's see if I got this. Right. They're not significant. In the Colombian case, they're not different. Right. Now, let's see. How do I get this thing to? Okay, so this is the top household income. These are basically, this depended on the country. It could be anywhere from 15 to 30%, or 15 to 25%. Is that what it was? Yeah, 15 to 20, 10 to 20%. Okay, 10 to 20% depending on the country, because the income they use these broad categories to get at household income, so we try to get the top categories in the 10 to 20% range, and then you can see that the differences are probably clearer if you do that. So this is who's in the middle class. Those countries, 10 to 20%. That's sometimes considered middle class. And then if you look at the opposite, the bottom, 10 to 20%. If I can get this baby to move, okay. Then it goes the other direction, pretty much. Although the whites, here again, it's the whites, self-identified whites are disproportionately compared to mestizos in the bottom. Okay, so then I'll move on to research question 2. Okay, how is actual skin color related to socioeconomic status in Latin America? Are skin color effects independent of class origin? Does the effect of skin color vary across Latin American countries? Okay, well, let me start with the idea of skin color. This is how we measured skin color. Okay. All of the interviewers had these little babies, these color palettes. If you want one, I can give you one after. I had how many did we did 2,000 of these, right? 2,000 of these, and we sent them out to people in 23 countries. And they, they didn't show these to the respondent, but they rated the person's skin color. Okay. So some people, I've done these reactions, not rarely, not as much as I thought I would. I kind of expected I might get them. It's like, whoa, it's like 19th century craniology or something like that, and you can't be doing that. And I think I got that reaction once. But other people saying, you can't, you're going to create conflict on the basis of skin color. It doesn't exist. But these are not sociologists. But that does, anyway. So the idea, of course, of skin color is that this is a way people may perceive others. So people may have these color palettes in their head, and they treat people accordingly. And so the racial discrimination often depends. So we look at the differences, these inequalities and discrimination. We say these things often depend on the way other people see you. So discrimination doesn't matter how you self-identify. I can say I'm, whatever, and it really doesn't matter. I mean, it's how other people see you. And of course, color is one of the variables. Of course, there's a lot of other things about physical features that people use, but we're trying to be as least invasive as possible. Psychologists have done these studies, but they do these studies of 20 university students, and they'll look at nose width and a whole bunch of different things. But of course, we just use a color palette. Okay, so how do the interviewers use this color palette? Based on actual skin colors, and they compared it to their facial tones. So, I often hear the reaction, well, some people count, the survey, the people in charge of the survey. Some people are often sitting in the sun a lot. Or sometimes people are dirty, So, yeah, you can find exceptions, right? I mean, the darker people can get lighter, though. I mean, unless you're Michael Jackson or something like that. But the darker people can get lighter, but some of the lighter people, sure, But we look at people that aren't in the sun, like office workers, and we find that, if you look at office workers who aren't in the sun very much, you can see differences in outcomes like income and education. Anyway, so I think people are pretty convinced of that in Latin America once you start talking about it, but it's good to get people talking about it. And these have been used in U.S. surveys, these things, including Doug Massey's used this in his surveys. Something similar, right? Yeah, it's different. But anyway, here. But the idea is, okay, he doesn't want to be associated with this. Of course, here's some more if anybody wants to. So the interesting thing is in Latin America, people like to talk about the palette in Spanish. It's the paleta. So it has this idea of a lollipop. It also means the lollipop. So people say, hey, the paleta, So that's the skin color palette. And so basically, I think if you tell the interviewers, you train the interviewers, we train the interviewers very carefully on this. And basically, they can giggle a little about this, but basically telling them that these are meaningful, and people make meaningful distinctions or they make distinctions and they ascertain meaning based on skin colors, and then they get it, and people take it very seriously. So in the U.S. surveys that they've used it, the problem is they don't do the continuum. The U.S. surveys that do it, is that right, Doug? They look at Latinos and they look at Latinos and they look at blacks, and then they look at skin tone variation. So it's not across the board like it is in Latin America. And this reflects probably the continuum that Latin Americans have. Yes?
Did you do any testing on the reliability of the coder, like on the coding?
Yeah. So we've looked at a little bit at the effects of the interviewer, for example. We also get the color of the interviewer. Yeah, we get the color. So we have the supervisor code the color of the interviewer and the education. And there's a very little effect. Very little effect. There is sometimes an effect so that in some places where racial self-identification is particularly flexible, that people will identify in lighter categories in relation to a dark-skinned interviewer. So, yeah.
This is what was done in the U.S. Census, though, in 40s, 50s. The interviewers, the enumerators, would go into a house, and they were instructed how to code people. They made the subjective decision.
Yeah, but they didn't have a color palette. I mean,
No, but they were given certain characteristics to look for, and then they could see the subjective.
well, they'd actually used it since 1880. And the mulatto category, you know, they were given instructions, but you know, the instructions are really loose, and you know, how do people use it? So the idea was that the color palette might give people a little bit more to go on. I mean, Mexico has had a survey, Brazil has a survey where you ask the respondents to code the color or code the race. And that gives you good information of how other people see you. But maybe this might be a little more, I mean, not completely, it's not perfect, but it's more objective than those ways of doing it. But you're right. So here, okay, so look what happens when we use color. The differences are a lot clearer. And so the color palette has, you know, 11 categories, and these are about a third. And basically, 1 to 3s are in Mexico, 4 and 5s are 1 to 3s are light, 4 and 5s are medium, and 6 pluses are dark. And so this looks like it gives much more of the idea of pigmentocracy than the ethnoracial categories. And so when we look at household income, similar. And top household income, and here you can see the big difference. So the people that are light, particularly in the middle class. And this is actually not surprising. If an American goes there, they see that. But when I first got to Brazil, and this is still clearly an era of racial democracy, people didn't see that. You know, the ideology is so strong, they say, no, that doesn't. Or they'll say, oh, it's class. It's based on class. But, you know, that goes so far as explaining. So well, why are the differences there in the first place? And why is class dependent on skin color? And in the bottom, it's just the opposite. And I guess in Mexico, the stratification is really clear. And Mexicans are particularly likely to deny it, which is really interesting. Renee and I have an article coming out in American Sociological Review, and we look exactly at the Mexican case. So. Oh, I'm sorry. That's a good question. The income, these are based on what do you call it? Percentiles. So the incomes were, you know, divided into 100, and so you. Yeah. So that was to try to create some comparability across the countries. Yes.
So I'm just wondering about the causal direction here. You yourself have said that incomes whitening, right? And so I'm just wondering about the perceptions of skin color.
Well, that's another issue. So the whitening part clearly happens in the ethnoracial identification. Right. That's the idea. But why is the white category so low? I mean, there's also darkening. I mean, these things are complex, and they depend. I mean, so this simple idea of money whitening, I think, is basically wrong. I mean, it's one possible outcome, but there's very different outcomes.
But I'm just wondering whether we should understand this as indicating that race leads to poor socioeconomic outcomes, or whether poor socioeconomic outcomes lead to the perception of darker skin.
No. I think this is the color palette. That's the reason we use the color palette. Well, I mean, that was part of the training, is, you know, try to avoid that, you know. I mean, we observed in Peru, and also, you know, we observed how people were using the color palette. They seemed like they were using it pretty clearly. I mean, I think, yeah. I mean, we tried any way we could to avoid that. I mean, not that it's totally unavoidable, but I think with the color palette, the idea is that you overcome these issues, especially with such big differences.
I mean, there's even a simple issue of how likely you are to work outside versus inside, and
well, like I said, I'll give you the data. Look at office workers. Not very many are outside, and you can look at income and education differences. Not as big, but they'll show. Okay. If you go to Brazil, there's a lot of people that don't work and are very middle class and they're on the beach all the time. So. Okay. That's anecdotal, right? I can say that. Okay, so then we look at, using our 23 countries, and we break this down by 4 regions. We look at the association between skin color. The color palette, it's not projecting very well. But anyways, this is actually 1, 2, so it goes on there, and something happened. But anyways, so basically the important thing is to look at the trend. There are some exceptions. It doesn't happen in all countries. Panama is the clear exception. Okay, now Panama. So blacks in Panama are mostly descendants of West Indians. So you can look at historical, kind of explain some of these things historically, or at least put the hypothesis out there and have the historians and other people look at them more carefully. So the West Indian immigrants came to Panama, and they to work on the canal. So they came. First, it was the French, and there were 3 phases of the U.S. Panama Canal project, and they were segregated by the U.S. So one of the things people say, well, Latin Americans didn't have segregation like the U.S. That's a simple idea of segregation versus mixture. Well, the exceptions are where the U.S. had dominance, or where there was, the U.S. had strong influence. And one was Panama, the other was Cuba, and the other was Puerto Rico, and they had segregation. But in the Panamanian case, blacks were segregated in the canal zone, but they were preferred workers over Panamanians because they spoke English. See? So it's complicated. And then since 1970s, descendants of West Indians, many of them no longer speak English, and Spanish has become their dominant language. West Indians. Jamaica, the West Indian Islands, they came to work on the canal zone, or they were brought to work on the canal zone. So they were segregated by the U.S. in the canal zone, but they were excluded from the Panamanian nation. So in the 1940s, Panama even revoked the citizenship of West Indian blacks, and they were all black. And some people, historians say that they also revoked the citizenship, or they excluded in many ways the citizenship of many Panamanian, what they call colonial blacks. But since 70, they've learned English, and they mostly speak Spanish, but they're concentrated around the canal zone. So they've really ridden their fortunes have ridden largely on the backs of the development of the Panama Canal. So they've done relatively well. So that's the Panamanian case, but that's an exception. But there's some West Indian stories in Costa Rica and Honduras real well that I'd have to explore a little for the U shape. But you can see that the decline's really clear, particularly for the Guatemalan case. We find that the skin color really makes a difference in Guatemala and Bolivia, which have large indigenous populations. Okay, this is the Andean. It's pretty consistent. Little tiny upturn in Colombia, but not very much.
So are you arguing that the upticks are maybe cohort-based differences?
No, I think they're the historical context of the country created different context for race and for access for blacks in this case. People with very dark skin are black. The other reason for the uptick is that the people in the middle are largely indigenous, and we know that indigenous people are the least well off. But often there's not that many indigenous people that would make a difference. Although the Panamanian case, 15% of the Panamanian population identifies as indigenous, so that's also part of the reason for the uptick. And and this is the southern cone and Brazil. And the reasons you have basically each point has 50 or more people. So in like Argentina and Chile, you don't have enough people on the dark end, so that's why we don't have those points. And in the Caribbean, there's only one Spanish-speaking country, Dominican Republic, there, and that's actually the steepest. But the pattern doesn't hold for Jamaica or Belize. I mean, for Belize or Guyana. I'm sorry, for Guyana or Belize, and I don't know the particularities of those countries. Those are very small countries, of course. So those are the 23 countries. So we have more data, and so there's a little bit of analysis I'll show. Oh, my time's getting short. So anyway, so let me get to research questions 3. Is the effect, okay, so they'll argue, sometimes they'll argue, you know, more sophisticated things is, well, you can explain racial differences by class origins. So we basically look at class and control for class origins. With the way sociologists do it, they look at parental occupation and we'll see if that makes a difference. And we want to see the extent to which ethno-racial identification and skin color overlap. Okay, I'm going to skip that one for now. Yeah, I'll skip that one for now. But here, this shows you the overlap. Okay, this is kind of the overlap between the ethno-racial categories and color. And you can see there's a lot of overlap. Okay, so people in the, you know, even in the white, these white categories tend to be on the left, but there's still a lot of overlap. So in indigenous, but on the mestizo category, you also have a lot of overlap with indigenous categories. So in places like Peru, I always mention this in Peru, is really clear, is that a lot of people that speak Quechua or Aymara identify as mestizo in that category. Huh? On the y-axis, those are the percentage of people. Yeah, yeah. This is the distribution of the people in the particular ethno-racial category. Okay. And this is predicting SES, basically controlling for class. So you can see that this is the case of Brazil. Pardos and pretos are worse off if you don't include skin color. If you include skin color, the effect of being pretos black, the effect of being black goes away for the most part. I mean, it's still negative, but not significant. And the pardos diminished. But this is a really strict control for parental occupation, for class origins. So even with class origins, skin color makes a difference. And we basically showed it for 8 countries that we had data for. Even when you control for class, skin color makes a difference. And the same thing for Mexico. In this case, do people identify as indigenous? We also use the indigenous mother tongue variable, and we found that was significant. I'm not going to get into all of these right now. Yeah, does it? Yeah, we have all these controls. Oh, yeah, the other thing is we have all these controls. So, but we can get more into that, but I'm running out of time. And then in Colombia, similar kind of thing. But the categories, the mulatto category and black category didn't seem to do very well. So class is clearly more important in all these places. But so class is important, but it basically, and I'll show you this other thing that I skipped. You can look at that. This has 8 countries. The 8 countries I talked about at the beginning. I mean, the 8 countries are all here. And then, one model without the interactions and then one model with interactions. And it basically shows you that skin color, even with controls for class, we don't have the ethno-racial categories here, but even with controls for parental occupation is still significant. And it's particularly significant with the interaction. I can show you a chart on that in Bolivia and Guatemala. So before I get to the takeaway points, let me show you that. Okay, so this is with the interactions, kind of a little snazzy chart. It shows you where skin color is on these things. But basically the point is, class is important in all of these, of course. Class origins, which may reflect accumulated, probably does reflect accumulated racial discrimination, even going back as far as slavery and these, this segregation of indigenous, implicit segregation of indigenous people. But it's still, even with those controls, it's still important. So these are the kind of the takeaway points I just try to write real quickly. Skin color matters, external identification. It particularly matters more in some countries than others. Ethno-racial identification, which is self-identification, may be less important than color. And what does it say about these censuses that are being collected, this data? So we might be preempting some of that. Ethno-racial identification, skin color do not necessarily overlap, and class origins also matter. And they may be more important in the strict way. And people say, aha, class is still important, and class is more important. Well, it isn't more important, but you can't deny that skin color and race our partner. And this is work in progress. And that's the end.